Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time we are going to be continuing to build additional systems and components for the first-person character controller, and what we're looking at today is we're going to be building up a bit of an equipment system. So the idea of being something that you can pick up and that you can use that will then have impacts. So it's going to be, seeing as we've gotten flying working, it's actually going to be where we are going to set up so we have a jetpack will be the plan. So let's dive on in. So where I want to actually begin with is I want to begin with setting up the bits that I'm going to need for the equipment manager. So user interface, things like of that. So what I'm going to do is, we already have some stuff for our HUD. So I'm going to have, and this will be set up a panel for this. So this will be the HUD equipment panel. I want to have this anchored down in the bottom left like of that, but I then want to adjust the sizing. So it's positioned directly there. Actually, the X should be 1. And then the width, let's go for, say, 300 by 200. That looks okay. I'm going to end up reducing that a bit, but that will do for now. And I'm going to darken the background of that. So that will just be a very dark background like that. And so what I want to have for each thing is I want to have an image. So equipment, image. And I also want to be able to have in there a little bit of a description. So we're going to bring in some text. Equipment name. So the name, we'll anchor that down the very bottom. Like that. Position that largely, I think there is good. And the text can just be centered. And it'll just be equipment name, which will center that in the display. That looks good. And the image, what I will do for the image is I do want the image to be sort of more centered. Centered I think is okay, but if we change the size of that, that image won't change size. So what I'm going to do is have it effectively sized, so in theory it's taking up pretty much the majority of the area. But then I'm going to put in just a temp image that I've set up just so I can configure this. Because what I would do is I would tell it to preserve the aspect ratio. That way then it'll appear centered, but it's something that will resize with that bit of UI. So if I adjust the equipment panel size and the equipment name, I could also auto size that. So a max of 36, but it can reduce in size if it needs to. So this, if I reduce the size, then everything rescales nicely. So I can drop that to like 150. Oops, not 1500, 150. So that's good. So I can clear that image because the settings for that are all good now. But I can check if I add that image back in. It does have those settings still, so that's good. So we've got our little bit of UI there, and we can start to set up the scripts for it. So this is going to have a equipment manager. That will actually sit on the player. And we will also, for the HUD, will follow similar sort of naming convention. So we will have a script that will be equipment UI. And I'm going to create a folder for our scripts. So we'll have this. Move these over into that so they're in the correct location. And we can set up our equipment UI easily enough. So that gets that script. Player gets the equipment manager script. And our equipment UI, we're going to just set up a couple little things so we can refer to those images, stuff like that, just before we prefab it, because we do want to make sure we prefab it, but we just want to get everything set up first. So we'll have a serialize field, and we will bring in using Unity Engine UI, and we'll also bring in using TM Pro. So we can have our image, equipment image, and we can also have TextMesh Pro. It'll be TextMesh Pro UGUI, equipment name. So I just want to link these up in this to begin with. So I can link up our image, can link up the name, and then that allows us to set up our prefabs folder, just so we can make that UI be a prefab. Good. Now we can start to set up our equipment. So there's going to be common things for our equipment. So I will actually set up a equipment base, and that's going to be the base scriptable object for it. Then I will have specific ones. So I'm going to have a C# script that is going to be equipment Jetpack. So let's set these up. So equipment base is going to be abstract because we're not going to ever directly instantiate it, but it will have a couple of key things. And because it's going to be a scriptable object, I'm going to actually make these just public. So it'll have a display name. It will also have an image. So that will end up being a sprite. And that will be we'll call it the icon for it. So that looks good. Then we can set up our equipment manager and Jetpack. So we'll open up all of these. So our Jetpack, well, that is going to inherit from our equipment base. It's a scriptable object, so it doesn't have start and update. We can set up our create asset menu. So menu name, equipment, Jetpack, and then the file name is just going to be Jetpack. So that's good. We can get our data set up. So how we'll have this work is when you pick up something, it will actually instantiate a copy of that. So under data, we can create here equipment, Jetpack. We can select our sprite, which we have our image for that. We can set the name. There'll be other settings that we put in there as well, but our focus for now is just getting these individual sections set up. So, okay, good so far. Well, equipment, we want to be able to switch between them, and we want to be able to tell it to use equipment. So if we go to our controller asset, so we can start to set up, we already have things like our primary action, which is tied into stuff like control. We do have pickup. That could also function as our use potentially. So we've got different options of what we could do with that. We also then are going to, pickup is going to be a good basis for our equipment selection stuff. So I'm actually going to duplicate that, and that will become equipment. That will be previous equipment. So we want to check and see what sort of ones we're using. So previous equipment, that I'm going to make that on the gamepad. we go to gamepad, we'll go for previous can be D-pad left. On keyboard, I'm going to make that left square bracket. I'll duplicate this, and this will become next equipment, which will use D-pad right. And on the keyboard, we can listen. We'll use that. And then we will have one more one, which is going to be use equipment, which on the gamepad we'll use D-pad down. And on keyboard, we will use F. So that gives us a lot of extra ones. Now, we won't listen for those in the character motor. We'll listen for those in the equipment manager. So the equipment manager is going to do the listening for those. Now, it is going to need some of the stuff from this. So we are going to grab our input system, because we do need to make sure we have that included. Because if we then take a look and see how does it work with things like our pickup, which we can see pickup is not in there. And that's because if we look at our pickup scanner, we're already doing this process of the actual function happens in here. So we'll be doing a similar setup where it gets this input value coming in. So, okay, equipment manager, well, we know the names of the functions that we need. It's on previous equipment, on next equipment, and on use equipment. So we're going to have protected void on previous equipment. We get an input value, and then what I'm going to do is if value is not pressed, we return. Otherwise, we'll do the logic for on previous. Then we'll have on next and on use. So, okay, equipment manager. Well, I'm going to set up some debug things. So debug, we're going to have equipment base and debug equipment to add. We will also have then a Boolean to perform that. So what we'll be able to check is if that's set. First thing we do is set it to false. And we will check that we've actually set a particular bit of debug equipment. Then I want to be able to do something where we go, okay, well, add equipment, debug equipment to add. So that's a function we know we're going to need. That should be public because that's a useful thing to be able to be doing. So, okay, we want to be able to add the equipment. So I need then a list of our active equipment. So I'm going to have a list, equipment a base, current equipment. So that's good. Now what I want to do is I want to add in a new instance of this. So when we've got a scriptable object, I want to instantiate, and I can give it the equipment. And new equipment is equal to that. And then what I would do is current equipment, add equipment. Now I need to keep track of which one's currently active. So I'm actually going to rename that to available equipment. Currently equipped. Actually no, all equipment. I think works. But we will have current equipment index is -1. Because what we want to do is when we go and add something in, well, if current equipment index is equal to -1, then I want to actually change. So I want to be able to do somewhere I've got select equipment 0. So we're going to need this ability to actually change what equipment we've got. So we're going to need a select equipment, which for now I'm going to keep that protected. Select equipment, new index. So we can go and say, well, current equipment index is equal to the new one. There'll be further logic we do as well. On previous, that then means we can say, well, if we take our current equipment index, we subtract 1 from it, so we go earlier in the list. Then, because we need to ensure it stays bounded within the list, we add all equipment count, and then we do a modulus with all equipment count, and we can set, or we can do select equipment on that. That will ensure that it properly wraps around. Next equipment will be a little bit similar. The main difference is that because we're adding to it, we don't need to add in count. The only reason we need to use in count the previous one is because we could go below 0 and we need that to sort of wrap around. So that's the only reason we do that. So, okay, so far so good. It's able to, we need to make sure that adds in the new equipment. So that's done. Well, when we select equipment, we want to update the UI. So, okay, I need to keep track of that UI HUD. So I'm going to also need here, and I'm not making this serialized because this is something we might need to discover at runtime. So I'm going to have equipment UI, linked UI. We can reasonably expect that there would only be 1. Now, because it's something that's on another class, I'm doing this as a find. So we'll do find object of type, equipment UI. And I want to do a select equipment, current equipment index. So select equipment, this is now, we're intentionally saying this could handle if it's got an invalid value that comes in here, which is okay. So if current equipment index is less than 0, or if it is greater than or equal to that count, then our linked UI, we're going to actually turn it off. Otherwise, we can go linked UI, game object, set active to true. And I will also then be able to go, I want to say, okay, set equipment, and be able to actually go and say all equipment, current equipment index. So then in our UI, it has to have our set equipment function, equipment base, and equipment. And then we can go, well, equipment image, and its sprite is our equipment icon, and equipment name is equipment.displayName. So what that should mean is when we go and add in the Jetpack, that it will automatically appear down here. So we've got our equipment manager. I'm going to select the Jetpack in here. So that should disappear at the start, and then, which is good, so that's disappeared. And then what I need to do, and this is always the fun, is managing to switch to the particular thing. If I go and debug adder, you can see I've now got a Jetpack there. Now, I only have the one, so switching does nothing, but that's okay. So that's good. We can debug at it. We'll end up setting up a pickup that can add it as well. So if we look around our scene, we do have a couple of pickups here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one that's a pickup on contact, move that over here, Jetpack, and with this, what I want to be able to do is we're going to update our prompt for it. This is going to be Jetpack. It's already got the stuff for picking it up. Now this, when I go and actually spawn it, I want it to actually do something. So on pickup, I want it to find the equipment manager and tell the equipment manager to actually do its particular sort of logic. So I'm going to create a script here that is going to be pickup Jetpack. And I could have this inherit from our pickup script here, or because it's very simple, the logic that it's needing to do, I could actually just have this, have serialize field, equipment base, equipment to add, and get rid of all of that with a public void on picked up. And what this will do is go find object of type, equipment manager. Now I'm intentionally not going to error check this because I actually want it to throw an exception F, it's invalid. So this will just be something we can link up, and I'll actually rename this to pickup equipment. And I need to remember and rename the C# file as well, because this will actually work as just a generic thing for picking up anything that's an equipment. So pick up equipment. So we can check our Jetpack. We might need to relink up the script because we have renamed stuff. It can get confused, but thankfully it didn't. So we can add in the Jetpack. Then we link this up. Pick up equipment. And then we can tell it, okay, we want you to run on picked up. So I should be able to run into that, and that should then give me the Jetpack. So let's find out. So it's over here. I run into it. I now have a Jetpack. So that's good. I want to then be able to use that Jetpack. So we need to be able to kick off when we go and use something. So on use equipment, well, we want to check if the equipment is valid first. So I'm going to do this same sort of check where, okay, because you could accidentally hit the key. So in that case, we will do nothing. We could show a message. So we could show a tutorial message, but we're not going to in this case. And then we'll just do a return. So I want to then be able to go, well, all equipment, current equipment index, on use. Well, actually, I'll have that be toggle use, because it could decide that it's just a one-shot thing. There's lots of things it could do. So I'm going to make it that what it will happen is if it returns true, it should actually then remove that equipment. So we'll go, because we've got remove add equipment, we're going to add in a remove equipment. And we'll provide that. So what I'll do is grab this out into a variable, just so we're not retrieving it multiple times, lessens the chance of us making errors. So remove equipment, well, okay. We're going to go public void remove equipment. And this one, I might actually not make it public, because adding Yep, makes sense to allow that to be added from anywhere, but removal, not necessarily. So removing, okay, well, all equipment, we want to remove that. Now, we want to check if it was the active equipment. So was active. So that will be the case if current equipment index is equal to all equipment index of. So if those are the same, then the one that we're removing was the currently active one. So if it was the active one, we need to update our current equipment index. So there's a few different ways that this could go. If we have no equipment, then that just becomes -1. So if all equipment count is 0, so we've got no equipment left, then we do select equipment -1. Now, if we have equipment left, we can go select equipment, and the key thing is we want to make sure that the number is still valid. So we'll go select equipment, current equipment index, and we modulus it with the count. That ensures that it's going to be in the valid range. If we were on the last item, that'll actually wrap us around, so it'll ensure the value is valid. So that's good. We handle removing. Well, our equipment, we now know that we need this toggle use. So I'm going to go to our base equipment and make sure that it has a public bool toggle use. And I'm going to make that abstract because we're going to say that it has to be implemented. So then this, okay, well, we know we need our toggle use. And so we can start to set this up. By default, we'll return false, so it doesn't get removed. Now we can see that it's getting a little bit grumpy. So we need to make sure we put an override. So, okay, it makes sense for this to have a duration. Duration. So we might say that it's able to be active for 30 seconds. That means we then also need to actually keep track of how much fuel essentially has been used. So duration used. We're going to need to keep track of if it's active. So toggle use has to go and change, well, is active to be the opposite of that. But we also are going to need a tick function. So in equipment base, I'm going to set up public abstract bool tick, because the Jetpack, we're not calling toggle use every frame, which is fair. So I'm going to have a public override bool tick, which again has to do the same thing of returning false by default. And again, it will return true if we should remove it. So if it's active, and only if it's active, then duration used increases. If duration used is greater than or equal to duration, then what we do is we're going to then return false. Sorry, return true. So used maximum duration. So we could just have it as that's a thing where, okay, now it's run out of fuel, it removes it. So that's good. But there's obviously bits of communication that need to happen with the character motor, because the character motor needs to be told to be flying. So we're going to set up just the placeholder ones for that now on start flying. And we'll also have a protected void on stop flying. So these in the toggle use, Well, the other thing we can check here is if duration used is greater than or equal to duration, we actually shouldn't toggle anything. In the unlikely event that that happens, we'll return true. We'll set isActive to false, and we will make sure it runs the on-stop flying. We'll only do that if it was currently active. So we don't want to turn it on if it actually is out of fuel. So, okay, that's good. Then what we would do here is, well, if we're now active, then on start flying. Otherwise, on stop flying. Because those will handle the talking to the character motor. If we use the maximum duration, then we do on stop flying. So that's good. We've got helpful information happening there. We need to have our equipment ticking. So that means in our update here, well, F current equipment index, and it would be handy to have a little helper here where we can go, okay, equipment base, current equipment, and if current equipment index is greater than or equal to 0, and current equipment index is less than all equipment count. So if that's the case, and this does end up getting a little bit long, so this might be one where what I do is I switch it over to being listed more like this. So if current equipment index is less than 0, we return null. Or if that current equipment index is greater than or equal to all equipment count. So then otherwise, we return that. So it gives us one that's going to be safe. So we can check if current equipment is not equal to null, then current equipment, tick. So, okay, we have a jetpack that should be ticking now. Now we need this on-start and on-stop flying to be able to switch movement modes, because our character motor does have the different movement modes, and at the moment it's got ground attached there, and we can add in movement mode flying. So it can have both of those. And if we then go to the character motor, so we're going to go to our character motor. And if we go down to our awake function, so in awake, at the moment, we just go and grab the movement mode. I'm actually going to switch that to, by default, it will grab the ground movement mode. But then I want it to be able to switch to a particular one. So it's going to need public void switch movement mode. And I need it to ideally be able to, how I ideally want this to work is I want to be able to do something where in the jetpack, okay, it's going to need to find the character motor. That's straightforward enough. We'll assume we can find the character motor. And I just, for now, we'll set up that. We will fix that up in a moment. But what I would do is something like, I'm able to go linked motor, switch movement mode flying, like that. So I want to be able to do that kind of setup for it, ideally. So giving it a type, because the motor itself is then going to need to here go, we'll get component, and I would ideally like to be able to give it a type. So how I can do that is I can say in brackets T here, so that switches movement mode like this. This one will do similar thing, but it will switch to movement mode ground, then here I want to be able to go, well, current movement mode is get component T. Now I can see that it is indicating an error here, and that's because T at the moment could be anything. So I can say is where T implements I movement mode. So that means whatever I pass in has to implement I movement mode. So that's good. So we need to get this character motor. Now we could do a find, but if we had AIs using the character motor as well, if we had multiple players, it could get multiple things back. It could get the wrong thing back. So what I want to do is our equipment manager does know the character that it's running on. So the equipment manager could, when it goes and adds equipment in, so because we instantiate equipment here, could go new equipment, link to, and we give it the equipment manager. So then in our equipment base, we could have a abstract void link to equipment manager, and then we'll implement that here, where that will be an override. And we can go and just say, well, character motor, linked motor, override void. We go linked motor is manager get component character motor. And then we just use that linked one. So it means we know it will be set before we try and do anything with it. And the final thing I would do is, seeing as we've got a nice function for doing the switching, I would actually go switch movement mode ground. So we have a nicer way of linking that up. So in theory, I should be able to go and pick up the jetpack. I should be able to go and start using it. And when I do, I should then be able to fly. So I've got the normal walking movement. I can jump everything like that. I'm going to hit the key for activating it. And so we can see we're getting an exception. So that's progress. It has at least tried to do it. And we can see we're getting errors. It doesn't have the motor state. So that's something where if we go and take a look, when we are setting up movement modes, we have to initialize them. So what I will do is when we switch movement mode, we then reinitialize that movement mode. So we can see even with that change, we're still getting an exception. And it's here and it's trying to access these colliders. So it's trying to access that on the state. So likely what we're running into is we haven't actually configured all of the things before we set the movement mode. So, and we can see those ones get configured there. So we're going to make sure we properly set up the state before we actually switch the movement mode. So we'll run this now. So now it moves normally. Got our jetpack, still in our normal ground movement. I use the jetpack. Now we're still getting a bunch of errors there. These are happening at a different spot. So these ones we can see it's trying to, thinks the state is grounded. So this is stuff that we're running into for it doing a transition there, because the state says that it's grounded, and as a result, it's expecting a ground check result that is going to have that information in it. And it's expecting that data to be there, but it may not actually be. So what we want to do is, that's likely in our flying. Our flying returns an empty ground check result, but it doesn't actually go and set that it's grounded. So this is where we would be going, okay, is grounded, is false. We can also turn off crouched. So when we're flying, we aren't actually ever going to be in those states. That's one of the things. When you're doing it, then the switching at real time or runtime, you are going to run into a whole bunch of different things, which is fine. So we've got our jetpack. Now we're not getting exceptions, and I can fly around. If I turn it off, I fall to the ground. If I switch on the jetpack, and now if we wait for a chunk of time, it should actually hit the point where I have fully used up the jetpack, and then it ends up removing it from my inventory, and I end up falling, which we'll get up to a bit of a decent height for this. So we're up at an okay height, and we can see we're now falling, which is good. So we successfully fell. Now, what would be nice is to have an actual indicator in the UI of, is it active? What's the level of usage? Things like that. So what I want to do is start adding in a couple of additional things here. So that is active setting actually would be really useful to have in the parent. So I'm going to move this into the base class, and we'll have a public bool is active that will be publicly gettable, but a protected set. Because then the equipment manager in our update logic here, if we have current equipment, then it can be ticking that. Now we need to handle the removal. So if that returns true, then we go remove equipment, current equipment. So that looks good, because that's the same logic we used here for when it goes to use it if that returns true. That's why the UI didn't update. So what we can then do is afterwards, if current equipment is still not equal to null, then our linked UI set equipment in use, current equipment is active. So set equipment in use, we can go over to our equipment UI, and we'll have just a public void equipment in use, and we'll adjust the tint color here. So color, if it's in use, then we'll use in use color, otherwise not in use color. And we can configure a couple of little colors here. Color, in use color, which will make that green, and color not in use color, which can be just the plain white color. So we should be able to now tell when it's active or not. So it should be, oops, I need to get our capitals correct. So then we'll have an indicator of if that jetpack is actually active or not, which will be great. So, okay. Well, we're active, but we haven't seen that color change. So if we go and take a look and make sure that it's actually updating the in-use, which we hadn't resaved our equipment jetpack there, so that's going to have changed where it was being set. It would have actually been being set internally. So we pick up the jetpack. Now we're using it. So it's green. Stop using it. False. That's good. Be kind of nice to know if the equipment has a limited time available. So Bull has fuel and be able to then get float get fuel remaining, because that would be another useful indicator to actually show. So again, that's another function that we have to implement. Which we can tell it to implement the particular function there. So get fuel remaining. Well, we have duration used divided by duration. And if we do 1 minus that, that will actually be the fuel remaining. That's how much time we've got left. So, okay, that's good. Equipment UI can also then have stuff for, it might actually be useful for the equipment UI to start to actually do some of the specific talking to the equipment. Depends on how you want to structure your UI, how smart you want to have it be. I generally want to try and avoid too much deep linking with the UI. So I'm going to set a set equipment time remaining. Actually, I wonder if it would be better to have equipment amount used. So we currently are storing the fuel remaining, which is going to go down. Depends upon how you want to actually show it. I think we'll go with fuel remaining. That way then it can be a progress bar that decreases. So set equipment time remaining. I have a show option for it. Time remaining. Because what I'll set up is we'll got a couple of ways of how we could do this. I'm actually going to do a slider. Remaining slider. So when we work with this, if it's being shown, then we'll go and set that game object to active. Otherwise, we'll turn that game object off. And what we'll do is we'll update the value on it. So we can do a set value without notify. We don't need any notifications firing for it. Time remaining. That's good. Then in our equipment manager, what we would do is we would say, okay, well, linked UI, set equipment time remaining. If it has fuel, then we would go and get the fuel remaining, like that. I will also do that whenever we go and select new bit of equipment, we need to update that part of the UI as well. So we would do that. We also are updating of if it's active, so set equipment in use. We're going to then go and say current equipment is active. And then this, I can also change over to current equipment. So that's good. We've got a couple of key bits up and running there. I could even actually move those functions, seeing as we do pass the equipment in, could actually do those here because we've already got a bit of equipment. Makes it just a little bit cleaner. So, okay, that's good. It means we should be able to have a progress remaining one once we add that into the UI. So that does mean we need to update the UI panel here. So I'm going to add in a slider which will turn off the actual handle on it, so that can go away. The fill area. That fill, I'm going to change the color of that to a very bright green. And we can see its values from 0 to 1. So we want to make sure that that fill is tinted a bright green color. That's good. So we just check and make sure that that does fill up the full range of it. So if we get to 1, so we do need to slightly adjust the size here, like that. So that's good. Now that's looking pretty good with that. So, okay, equipment, fuel. I'm going to anchor that similar to what we did for the equipment name. So we'll anchor that down the very bottom. Might actually even have that right at the very bottom there, like that, and move the equipment name up ever so slightly, like that. That looks pretty good. Equipment panel, we can link that up so it talks to the slider now. We'll update our prefab. The other thing that we could potentially do is once it we could change that color as we're moving through it. There's a lot of different things we could actually be doing with that. But let's test this out. I should be able to now see the amount of fuel that I have left. So go and pick this up. Now it doesn't show anything because I need to update my data for the actual equipment. So Jetpack has fuel. Pick that up. I can see I've got full fuel. Flying. I can see that now decreasing. So lets me keep track of that, so I can flap a bunch, fall, and I can activate it while I'm falling. So I'm able to use it at any point in time there. If I try and switch at the moment, nothing happens. If I turn off the jetpack and then manage to go and add in a debug one, because we don't prevent it having multiple, add in that equipment, can see I can now switch between jetpacks. This one is active, and I can still switch to other equipment. We don't auto deactivate, which is fine. And then I fall, and I've only got one jetpack in my inventory. Now we could do things where, okay, if you activate one bit of equipment, it deactivates others. That's something that I'm not going to implement a specific thing for that at the moment because that's very down to the style that you want in the game. You could potentially limit so that you only have one of certain equipment in the inventory as well. That's something that would be an option, but again, that depends very much on the style of what you're after for the game. You might want to support multiple ones. That's very down to the particulars of what you might need there. But we have our movement modes switching dynamically. We have an equipment system we can easily add equipment into. We have a pickup that can just add in any equipment that you want to the inventory. And we're able to use our jetpack and fly around quite happily now. So dive on in and experiment with this, see if there's any other bits you'd like to be adding to it, if there's any bits of equipment that you can think of you'd like to see, chuck those in as a suggestion as well. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe, really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub and I've put a link to that in the description below. You can use that code freely in any of your own projects, commercial, non-commercial ones. If you're looking to find other related videos, I do have a video archive, which there's also a link to in the description. That's a searchable archive of all of the videos. You can search based upon description, keywords, things like that. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description below also. But until next time, bye.